In the autumn of 1876, railroad workers laying track through the remote hills of southwestern Missouri made a discovery that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Buried beneath what had once been the foundation of a burned farmhouse, they found 17 human skeletons arranged in neat rows, each missing specific bones, femurs, ribs, and skulls that had been carefully removed with surgical precision. What made this discovery truly horrifying wasn't just the methodical nature of the burials or even the evidence of saw marks on the remaining bones. It was the brass medical instruments found alongside them and the leather-bound journal that detailed 3 years of experiments involving what the author called therapeutic anthropy, the medicinal consumption of human flesh. The Missouri State Medical Board immediately sealed all records, and the local sheriff received orders from Jefferson City to classify the case as a catastrophic fire with multiple casualties. For nearly 50 years, the truth about Dr. Cornelius Endecott's private medical facility remained buried as deeply as his victims. But tonight, through recently discovered correspondence and survivor testimonies that somehow escaped destruction, we can finally reveal the terrifying reality of what happened at Endicott Farm. Before we continue with the story of Dr. Cornelius Endicott and his macabre medical practice, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. Drop a comment telling me what state or city you're in, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss these dark tales from America's hidden history. The discovery of those 17 skeletons was just the beginning of a story that would challenge everything people thought they knew about post-Civil War medicine and the desperate lengths some would go to heal the wounds of America's bloodiest conflict. In 1873, the hills of southwestern Missouri still bore the scars of a war that had ended 8 years earlier. This region, caught between Confederate sympathies and Union occupation, had seen some of the conflict's most brutal guerrilla warfare. Towns like Carthage and Joplin were slowly rebuilding, but the countryside remained dotted with abandoned homesteads and men who carried invisible wounds that no conventional medicine could touch. Dr. Cornelius Endicott arrived in this broken landscape with impeccable credentials and revolutionary promises. A graduate of Harvard Medical School's class of 1851, he had served as a field surgeon with the 14th Massachusetts Infantry, witnessing amputations, battlefield trauma, and the primitive medical practices that left more soldiers dead from infection than enemy bullets. His war service had earned him commendations, but those who knew him noticed a disturbing change in his demeanor after the Battle of Antietam, where he had worked for 3 straight days in a field hospital that resembled a carol house more than a place of healing. After the war, Endicott spent 2 years in Europe, claiming to study advanced surgical techniques in Vienna and Berlin. His letters home, preserved in the Massachusetts Historical Society, spoke enthusiastically about revolutionary treatments for what physicians were beginning to understand as soldiers' heart, what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. He wrote extensively about German physicians who believed that mental trauma could be cured through specific dietary interventions, and about Swiss doctors experimenting with what he cryptically referred to as essence therapies. When Endicott purchased 320 acres of farmland 12 miles northeast of Carthage in the spring of 1873, local residents were initially grateful. The property, a sprawling farm with a large main house, several outbuildings, and a natural spring, had sat empty since its Confederate sympathizing owners fled during the war. Endecott's plans to establish a private medical facility for the treatment of war-related nervous disorders seemed like exactly what the region needed. He arrived with his wife, Helena, a quiet woman from a prominent Boston family, and their teenage daughter, Margaret. Helena had been a battlefield nurse during the war, and neighbors noted her skill in treating common ailments. Margaret, 18 and well-educated, served as her father's assistant in what he claimed would be a small, exclusive practice, treating wealthy veterans who could afford experimental treatments. The facility officially opened in August 1873, advertising in newspapers across Missouri, Kansas, and Arkansas. The advertisements were carefully worded: Dr. Cornelius Endicott, Harvard-trained physician and war veteran, offers revolutionary treatments for nervous disorders, melancholia, and war-related trauma at his private facility in the Missouri Hills. Discreet, comfortable accommodations, advanced European methods, correspondence invited from families seeking alternatives to conventional asylum care. The local community of Carthage watched with interest as well-dressed families began arriving by railroad, then continuing by private carriage to the secluded facility. These weren't the desperate poor seeking charity care, but wealthy merchants, plantation owners, and former officers who could afford to pay substantial fees for what Endicott promised would be groundbreaking treatment. Samuel Ridgefield, a former Union captain suffering from severe nightmares and what his family described as fits of violent shaking, was among the first patients. His brother, a successful grain merchant from Kansas City, had paid Endecott's substantial fee of $500 for a 3-month treatment program. Samuel's last letter home, dated the 15th of September, 1873, expressed optimism about Dr. Endecott's methods, though he mentioned some treatments that seemed unusual but scientifically sound. After that, his family received only brief monthly reports from Endicott himself, assuring them that Samuel was responding well to treatment and participating enthusiastically in the healing process. The first sign that something was deeply wrong at Endicott Farm came in the spring of 1874, when Martha Cunningham made an unannounced visit to check on her son, Lieutenant Thomas Cunningham, who had been a patient for 7 months. Martha, the widow of a successful Missouri lumber merchant, had grown suspicious after her son's letters suddenly stopped arriving in February, replaced by formal monthly reports written in Dr. Endecott's clinical handwriting. What Martha found that April morning would haunt her for the rest of her life, though it would be years before anyone believed her increasingly frantic claims. She arrived at the farm shortly after dawn, having traveled from Springfield by railroad and then hiring a local man to drive her the final 12-mile in his wagon. The driver, a farmer named Josiah Brennan, later told authorities that Mrs. Cunningham had seemed nervous during the journey, constantly checking a pocket watch and asking him to hurry. When they reached the farm's entrance, marked by a simple wooden sign reading Endicott Private Medical Facility, Martha asked Brennan to wait with his wagon while she conducted her visit. The main house, a 2-story structure painted white with green shutters, appeared well maintained from the outside. Gardens had been planted in neat rows, and smoke rose from 2 chimneys, suggesting normal domestic activity. But Martha would later describe an immediate sense of wrongness, a smell she couldn't identify, sweet and cloying, that seemed to emanate from the building itself. Dr. Endicott greeted her at the front door with professional courtesy, but Martha noticed his clothes were stained with what appeared to be blood, and his hands, despite obvious recent washing, still bore dark residue under his fingernails. He apologized for his appearance, explaining that he had been conducting an emergency procedure and hadn't had time to change clothes. His manner was calm and confident, as befitted a Harvard-trained physician. But Martha later recalled something disturbing about his eyes, a fervent intensity that made her think of religious fanatics she had encountered during the war. When Martha requested to see her son immediately, Endicott explained that Thomas was in a critical phase of treatment that couldn't be interrupted. He guided her instead to his office, a room lined with medical texts and anatomical charts, where he presented her with detailed notes about Thomas's progress. The notes, written in precise medical terminology, described various dietary interventions and essence therapies that were supposedly showing remarkable results in treating Thomas's war-related nervous condition. "Your son has embraced the most advanced treatments available anywhere in America," Endicott told her, his voice carrying the authority of medical expertise. "We are seeing unprecedented success in cases like his, but the process requires complete isolation from outside influences during the critical transformation period." Martha pressed for more details about these treatments, but Endicott deflected her questions with technical language about neurological regeneration and cellular restoration through specialized nutrition. He showed her what appeared to be official correspondence with medical colleges in Boston and Philadelphia, discussing his innovative work with anthropological dietary studies and their applications to mental health treatment. Despite Endecott's reassurances, Martha's maternal instincts screamed that something was terribly wrong. She demanded to see the facility's other patients, or at least to observe a treatment session from a distance. Endecott's refusal was polite but firm. Patient confidentiality and the delicate nature of the treatments made such visits impossible. As Martha prepared to leave, frustrated but not yet fully alarmed, she heard something that would change everything, a sound echoing from somewhere deep within the house. A human voice raised in what might have been laughter or might have been screaming. The sound lasted only seconds before being abruptly cut off, but Martha would later swear it was her son's voice, distorted by an emotion she couldn't name. When she asked ENDECOTT about the sound, he explained calmly that patients sometimes experienced intense emotional releases as part of their healing process, and that Thomas was likely expressing joy at a breakthrough in his treatment. His explanation was medically plausible, delivered with professional confidence, but Martha later said that something in the doctor's eyes suggested he was lying. The drive back to Carthage with Josiah Brennan passed in tense silence. Martha questioned the farmer about what he might know of the facility, but Brennan admitted he rarely came to this remote area and had heard little local gossip about the doctor or his patients. He did mention almost casually that he had noticed an unusually large number of graves in the small cemetery behind the main house, more than seemed appropriate for a medical facility that had been operating for less than a year. That night, alone in her room at Carthage's only hotel, Martha wrote a long letter to her brother in St. Louis, describing her visit and her growing fears about her son's welfare. She also began what would become a detailed diary of her attempts to learn more about Dr. Endecott's methods and the fate of his patients. Her entries from this period reveal a woman torn between her instinctive terror and the social pressure to trust a Harvard-educated physician's expertise. Over the following weeks, Martha's investigations revealed disturbing patterns. She discovered that at least 6 other families had stopped receiving personal letters from their loved ones at Endicott Farm, receiving instead only the doctor's formal monthly reports. When she attempted to contact these families directly, she found that several had moved away from the area entirely, while others refused to discuss their experiences with Endecott's facility. The transformation of the Endecott facility from a place of supposed healing to something far more sinister hadn't happened overnight. In the months following Martha Cunningham's disturbing visit, a pattern began to emerge that would horrify anyone who took the time to piece together the scattered evidence. Dr. Endicott had been methodical in his descent into madness, documenting every step with the scientific rigor he had learned at Harvard. His journal, discovered decades later in a hidden compartment behind a false wall in the farmhouse basement, revealed the twisted logic that had guided his transformation from healer to predator. The entries began innocuously enough, dated from his first weeks at the farm in 1873. Endecott wrote about his genuine desire to help veterans suffering from what he recognized as a new kind of war wound, psychological trauma that conventional medicine couldn't address. His early patients seemed to benefit from the peaceful rural setting, regular meals, and individual attention that the facility provided. Samuel Ridgefield, the former Union captain, was indeed improving under Endecott's initial treatment regimen of rest, moderate exercise, and what the doctor called rational conversation therapy. But by October 1873, the tone of Endecott's journal entries began to shift. He wrote increasingly about his European studies, particularly his time with a controversial German physician named Dr. Klaus Hartmann, whose theories about vital essences and biological regeneration had been rejected by mainstream medical institutions. Hartmann believed that mental illness resulted from deficiencies in what he termed primal nutrients that could only be obtained from human tissue. Endecott's first experiment with Hartmann's theories involved Samuel Ridgefield, whose improvement had plateaued after 2 months of conventional treatment. In a journal entry dated the 3rd of November, 1873, Endecott wrote, "Subject R continues to suffer from periodic episodes of violent trembling and night terrors. Conventional treatments have proven inadequate. Have decided to implement H's dietary protocol on experimental basis. Subject's family has granted complete medical authority for duration of treatment. Prepared first essence supplement this morning using tissue obtained from local mortician. Subject consumed supplement unknowingly in his evening meal. Will monitor for improvements." The local mortician was Benjamin Storrs, who operated a funeral parlor in Carthage and who, according to later investigations, had been selling Endecott what he claimed were anatomical specimens for medical research. Strew, a man with massive gambling debts, asked no questions about why a rural physician needed fresh human tissue, accepting Endecott's payments and his explanations about advanced medical studies. Over the following weeks, Endecott's journal documented what he believed were remarkable improvements in Samuel's condition. The former captain's nightmares decreased, his trembling episodes became less frequent, and he seemed more alert and engaged during their daily sessions. Endicott attributed these changes entirely to what he called his essence therapy, though any objective observer might have noted that Samuel was simply benefiting from time, rest, and individual attention. Emboldened by what he saw as success, Endicott began incorporating human tissue into the meals served to all his patients. His wife, Helena, who managed the facility's kitchen, initially resisted what she saw as a grotesque and dangerous practice. But Endicott, wielding his medical authority and pointing to Samuel's apparent improvement, gradually convinced her that they were pioneers in a revolutionary treatment that would change medicine forever. Helena's own diary, found alongside her husband's papers, reveals her struggle with conscience and her gradual acceptance of increasingly horrific practices. In an entry dated December 1873, she wrote, "Cornelius showed me medical texts tonight that seem to support his methods. The German doctor's research appears thorough, and Samuel does seem much improved. If this can help these poor men who suffered so much in the war, perhaps we are obligated to continue despite my reservations. I pray God will forgive us for what feels like sin, but maybe science." By early 1874, Endecott's supply arrangement with Sturs was proving inadequate. The mortician could provide only limited quantities of tissue, and Endicott had begun to believe that fresher specimens would prove more effective. His journal entries from this period show a man whose scientific obsession was overwhelming his moral judgment. The tissue obtained from S shows signs of deterioration that may compromise the vital essences. Consider need for fresher specimens to maximize therapeutic benefit. Dunto. The solution to Endecott's supply problem came in February 1874, when one of his patients, Lieutenant Marcus Thornburg, died suddenly during the night. Thornburg, a former Confederate officer from Arkansas, whose family was paying Endicott $400 per month for his care, had been suffering from severe depression and had frequently spoken of suicide. When Helena found him dead in his room, apparently from a heart attack, Endicott saw opportunity rather than tragedy. Instead of immediately notifying Thornburg's family, Endicott performed what he called a complete anatomical examination on the body. His journal entry for the 12th of February, 1874 reads, "Its unexpected demise provides unprecedented opportunity to obtain optimal specimens for essence therapy. Body shows no signs of disease that would compromise therapeutic value. Have extracted approximately 15 pounds of suitable tissue for processing. Informed family by telegram that T suffered heart failure and that burial took place immediately due to health concerns. They have accepted this explanation and expressed gratitude for our care during his final days." Marcus Thornburg's family never knew that their son's body, buried in the small cemetery behind the Endicott facility, was missing most of its organs and muscle tissue. They never knew that their monthly payments had been funding not his treatment, but his transformation into what Endicott had begun to think of as medicine. With access to fresh human tissue, Endicott escalated his experiments. He began serving what he called enhanced meals to all his patients, carefully monitoring their reactions and documenting what he believed were remarkable improvements in their conditions. His patients, trusting their Harvard-trained physician and grateful for what seemed to be effective treatment, consumed their meals without question. But Endecott's appetite for experimentation was growing beyond what natural deaths could supply. By the summer of 1874, Dr. Cornelius Endicott had crossed a line from which there could be no return, though he would later claim in his journals that every step was justified by scientific necessity and remarkable therapeutic results. The catalyst for his final descent into horror came with the arrival of Jonathan Prescott, a former Union artillery officer whose wealthy family from Chicago had heard about Endecott's revolutionary treatments through word-of-mouth recommendations from other veterans' families. Prescott suffered from what his family described as episodes of violent rage, alternated with periods of complete withdrawal, symptoms that had made him unemployable and a danger to his own household. Prescott's case notes, preserved in Endecott's methodical records, show a man completely broken by war. At the Battle of Fredericksburg, he had watched his entire artillery battery obliterated by Confederate fire, leaving him as the sole survivor among 18 men. He had spent the remainder of the war in various field hospitals, suffering from what military physicians dismissed as nervous exhaustion, but what modern medicine would recognize as severe combat trauma. Unlike Endecott's previous patients, however, Prescott proved resistant to the doctor's essence therapy. After 6 weeks of treatment, including regular doses of what Endecott now called human vital supplements, Prescott showed no improvement. In fact, his condition seemed to worsen with increasingly violent outbursts that required physical restraint. Endecott's journal entry for the 15th of August, 1874, reveals his frustration and his decision to take a more direct approach. Subject P continues to resist treatment despite optimal dosage of vital essences, beginning to suspect that preserved tissue lacks sufficient potency for severe cases. Dr. Hartman's writings suggest that maximum therapeutic benefit requires immediate consumption of fresh tissue from living subjects have resisted this approach due to practical considerations. But PE's case may require extreme measures. What Endecott was contemplating went beyond the consumption of tissue from recently deceased patients. His studies of Hartman's work had convinced him that the most potent vital essences could only be obtained from living subjects, and that the psychological benefits of his therapy were actually enhanced by the patient's participation in what he had begun to think of as a communion of healing. The first deliberate murder at Endecott Farm took place on the 23rd of August, 1874, though the doctor's careful documentation presented it as a mercy killing that served both humanitarian and scientific purposes. The victim was Samuel Ridgefield, the Union captain, who had been Endecott's first success story. By August, Samuel had been at the facility for nearly a year, and while his initial improvements had been dramatic, he had begun to suffer from new symptoms that Endecott attributed to vital essence deficiency. Samuel had developed severe digestive problems, persistent anemia, and episodes of what Endecott described as cannibalistic cravings that left him begging for more of the special meals that the doctor had been providing. In reality, Samuel's symptoms were likely the result of chronic malnutrition and the psychological effects of unknowingly consuming human flesh for months. But Endecott, completely committed to his twisted theories, saw Samuel's deterioration as proof that his patient needed fresh rather than preserved tissue. Endecott's journal documents the killing with clinical detachment. Subject R has reached terminal stage of vital essence deficiency despite months of treatment. Condition has become painful and dignity-destroying. Have decided to provide merciful release while simultaneously obtaining fresh specimens for treatment of subject P. Administered fatal dose of morphine at 11:30 p.m. Death occurred peacefully at 11:47 p.m. Immediately began extraction procedures to maximize therapeutic potential of specimens. Helena Endecott's diary reveals her horror at this development, but also her increasing psychological entrapment in her husband's madness. Her entry for the 24th of August reads, "What Cornelius did to poor Samuel was murder, whatever he calls it. But I have helped prepare those horrible meals for so many months now. What does that make me? I cannot leave Margaret here alone with him, but I cannot see how to escape what we have become. God help us all." Samuel Ridgefield's death was reported to his family as a sudden heart attack, and his body was buried quickly in the farm's expanding cemetery. But portions of his organs and muscle tissue were carefully processed in Endecott's makeshift laboratory, a converted root cellar beneath the main house, where the doctor had installed surgical tables, preservation equipment, and detailed anatomical charts. Jonathan Prescott received his first meal containing fresh human tissue on the 25th of August, 1874. Endecott's records show that the results were immediate and, from his perspective, miraculous. Prescott's violent episodes ceased almost overnight, replaced by what the doctor described as profound calm and unusual mental clarity. Within a week, Prescott was participating enthusiastically in what Endecott called therapeutic discussions about the nature of healing and the necessity of sacrifice. But Prescott's transformation wasn't recovery. It was the psychological break of a man who had realized on some level what was happening to him and had chosen madness over the unbearable reality. His letters home, which Endecott encouraged as part of therapy, took on an increasingly strange tone that should have alarmed his family, but which they interpreted as signs of improvement. "The treatments here are unlike anything I could have imagined," Prescott wrote to his brother in September 1874. "Dr. ENDECOTT has shown me truths about healing that go beyond conventional medicine. I feel as though I am becoming someone entirely new, someone who understands the deeper connections between all living things. I no longer have nightmares about the war because I understand now that death and life are part of the same essential process." As autumn arrived, Endecott's facility housed 8 patients, all of whom were unknowingly consuming human flesh in their daily meals and participating in what the doctor had begun to call communion meals, where they shared special preparations that Endicott claimed contained the most potent healing essences. But Martha Cunningham had not forgotten her son Thomas, or the disturbing sounds she had heard during her April visit. Throughout the summer and early fall, she had continued her own investigation, corresponding with other families who had relatives at the facility and growing increasingly convinced that something terrible was happening at Endicott Farm. Her breakthrough came in October when she received a letter from Virginia Prescott, Jonathan's sister, who shared Martha's concerns about the strange tone of her brother's recent correspondence. The two women began comparing notes about their experiences with Dr. Endicott, and what they discovered filled them both with dread. By October 1874, Martha Cunningham and Virginia Prescott had uncovered a pattern that convinced them both that Dr. Endecott's facility was harboring a secret far darker than medical malpractice. Their correspondence, preserved in Virginia's family papers, reveals two intelligent women piecing together evidence that would have challenged the sanity of anyone forced to confront its implications. Martha had spent months tracking down families who had sent relatives to Endicott Farm, and what she discovered was a consistent pattern of communication that followed the same disturbing trajectory. Initial letters from patients were normal, expressing gratitude for Dr. Endecott's care and optimism about their treatment, but after approximately 3 months, the personal letters stopped, replaced by brief formal reports from Endicott himself. Families who pressed for more information were told that their relatives had entered advanced treatment phases that required complete isolation from outside influences. Virginia's investigation focused on financial records, and what she found was equally troubling. Families were continuing to pay ENDECOTT substantial monthly fees long after their relatives' personal correspondence had ceased, often for periods extending well beyond the original treatment timelines. Some families had been paying for more than 18 months, receiving only occasional reports that their loved ones were responding well to treatment and participating enthusiastically in advanced therapeutic protocols. The two women's most chilling discovery came when they compared the names of patients whose families had lost contact with them. Cross-referencing newspaper, obituaries, and funeral records, they found that at least 12 men who had been patients at Endicott Farm had been buried in local cemeteries across Missouri, Arkansas, and Kansas, but their families had never been notified of their deaths. Instead, these families were still paying monthly fees and receiving reports that their relatives were alive and improving. Martha's diary entry for the 18th of October, 1874, captures her growing horror. "Virginia has confirmed what I feared most, that at least some of the men we've been paying to treat are already dead and buried. But if Thomas and the others are dead, who is Dr. Endicott treating? And why does he continue to accept payment for caring for corpses? There is some deception here, so monstrous that I can barely allow myself to consider its true nature." Determined to uncover the truth, Martha decided to make another visit to Endicott Farm, but this time with preparation and witnesses. She recruited her brother-in-law, Judge William Cunningham, a respected circuit court judge from Springfield, and Sheriff Deputy Robert Hayes, who agreed to accompany them on what Martha described as a welfare check on her son. The second visit to Endicott Farm took place on the 25th of October, 1874, and would finally expose the full horror of what Dr. Cornelius Endicott had created in the Missouri hills. The party arrived at the farm just after noon, traveling in Judge Cunningham's official carriage and making no attempt to conceal their authority. From the moment they approached the main house, they sensed something fundamentally wrong with the scene. The building appeared well maintained from a distance, but closer inspection revealed windows that were covered with heavy curtains, preventing any view of the interior. The smell that Martha remembered from her first visit, sweet, cloying, and somehow organic, was stronger now, permeating the air around the entire property. Dr. Endicott met them at the front door with the same professional courtesy he had shown Martha 6 months earlier. But Judge Cunningham noted immediately that the physician appeared to have lost considerable weight, and that his eyes held what the judge later described as the fervor of a religious fanatic combined with the calculation of a confidence man. When Judge Cunningham announced that they were conducting an official welfare check on Thomas Cunningham and requested immediate access to all patients, Endecott's demeanor shifted from professional courtesy to barely controlled agitation. He insisted that such a visit would violate patient confidentiality and could undo months of delicate therapeutic progress. His objections, while medically plausible, struck all 3 visitors as the protests of a man desperate to prevent inspection of his facility. "I'm afraid you don't understand the revolutionary nature of the treatments we're conducting here," Endicott told them, his voice carrying an edge of desperation beneath its professional tone. "These men have been broken by war in ways that conventional medicine cannot address. We have developed methods here that are showing unprecedented success, but they require complete commitment from both patient and practitioner. Outside interference could prove catastrophically damaging." Judge Cunningham, however, was not a man to be dissuaded by medical authority, particularly when that authority seemed to be concealing something. He informed Endicott that as a circuit court judge, he had the legal authority to inspect any medical facility operating in his jurisdiction, particularly when questions had been raised about patient welfare. What happened next would be seared into the memories of all 3 visitors for the rest of their lives. As they entered the main house, the smell that had been noticeable outside became overwhelming, a combination of medicinal alcohol, decay, and something else that Martha would later describe as resembling a butcher shop. The interior of the house, which should have resembled a medical facility or comfortable boarding house, instead felt more like a stage set designed to conceal darker realities. Dr. Endicott guided them first to his office, where he presented files documenting the remarkable progress of his current patients. But when Judge Cunningham requested to see the patients themselves, Endecott's explanations became increasingly frantic and contradictory. Some patients, he claimed, were sleeping due to their medication schedules. Others were participating in outdoor therapy sessions in remote parts of the property. Still, others were in critical treatment phases that couldn't be interrupted. Deputy Hayes, who had remained silent during these exchanges, finally spoke up. "Doctor, in my experience, when a man has nothing to hide, he's eager to show you everything. Your reluctance to let us see these patients suggests you have something to conceal." It was at that moment that they heard the sound that would haunt Martha Cunningham for the rest of her life. A human voice, muffled, but unmistakably screaming, coming from somewhere beneath their feet. The sound lasted only seconds before being abruptly silenced, but it was enough to galvanize Deputy Hayes into action. "That scream came from below us," Hayes announced, drawing his service revolver. "Dr. Endicott, I'm placing you under arrest pending investigation of this facility. Judge Cunningham, I recommend we search this building immediately and thoroughly. What they found in the basement of the Endecott farmhouse would be documented in court records that were immediately sealed and wouldn't be open to public view for more than 70 years. The basement laboratory beneath the Endecott farmhouse revealed a horror so methodical and complete that even experienced law enforcement officers struggled to comprehend its full scope. What Dr. Cornelius Endecott had created wasn't simply a place of murder. It was a systematic operation that had transformed human beings into what he genuinely believed was medicine. The converted root cellar had been divided into several rooms, each serving a specific function in Endecott's grotesque process. The first room contained 2 surgical tables equipped with restraints surrounded by medical instruments that gleamed with recent use. Anatomical charts covered the walls, but these weren't standard medical illustrations. They were hand-drawn diagrams showing which portions of the human body contained what Endecott called optimal vital essences and detailed procedures for extracting these materials from living subjects. Judge Cunningham's official report, unsealed only in 1947, documented the discovery with legal precision. The surgical area contained evidence of recent operations, including blood stains, human hair, and tissue fragments, preserved in glass containers. Along one wall were what appeared to be human organs labeled with dates and patient initials. The labeling system suggested a methodical approach to harvesting and processing human remains for consumption. The second room served as ENDECOTT's processing laboratory, equipped with grinding equipment, preservation chemicals, and cooking apparatus that had been used to transform human tissue into what appeared to be conventional food products. Recipe books found in this room detailed methods for disguising the taste and texture of human flesh, incorporating it into stews, roasts, and even preserves that could be stored for extended periods. But it was the third room that revealed the full psychological horror of ENDECOTT's operation. Here they found 3 men who had once been patients, but who had been transformed into something that challenged the observer's understanding of human nature. These men, including Thomas Cunningham and Jonathan Prescott, were alive, but had been so completely broken by their experiences that they no longer seemed entirely human. Martha Cunningham's diary, written weeks after she had recovered enough to process what she had seen, captures the indescribable horror of that moment. Thomas was alive, but the son I had raised and loved was gone. The thing that wore his face looked at me with recognition, but also with hunger. When I tried to embrace him, he pulled away and asked in a voice I barely recognized whether I had brought him anything to eat. When I asked what he meant, he said he was hoping I might have brought him some of the good food that Dr. Endicott served. I realized with horror that my son had been trained to crave human flesh and that he no longer understood why this should disturb anyone. Dr. Endecott's journal entries from the final weeks of his operation reveal a man who had become completely convinced that he was conducting legitimate medical research. His entry for the 20th of October, just 5 days before his arrest, reads, "Subjects C, P, and M continue to show remarkable improvement under the enhanced dietary protocol. Their war-related traumas have been completely resolved, replaced by what I can only describe as perfect mental clarity and acceptance of natural biological processes. They understand now that healing requires participation in the fundamental cycles of consumption and renewal that govern all life." The investigation revealed that Endecott had been selecting patients based on their isolation and their families' willingness to pay extended fees without demanding frequent contact. Men who had been estranged from their families due to their war trauma or whose relatives lived far from Missouri were ideal candidates for what Endecott had come to think of as his complete treatment protocol. Helena Endecott was found in the main house kitchen where she had been preparing what her husband's journals called communion meals, elaborate dinners that incorporated human tissue into every dish and that were served to patients as part of their therapeutic participation in healing rituals. Her mental state at the time of arrest was described by Deputy Hayes as complete dissociation from reality, suggesting that she had suffered a psychological break from her complicity in her husband's crimes. Their daughter, Margaret, had been living in this environment for more than a year, helping to prepare meals and assist with medical procedures that she had been taught to view as revolutionary healing methods. Her testimony given weeks later, after extensive psychological evaluation, revealed that she had been gradually indoctrinated into accepting cannibalism as medical treatment. Though she had never fully understood the true nature of what her father was doing, the full scope of Endecott's operation became clear as investigators pieced together his records. Over the course of 18 months, at least 23 men had been patients at his facility. 17 had died and been processed for consumption, their deaths unreported to families who continued to pay monthly fees. The remaining 6 had been transformed into willing participants in what Endecott called therapeutic anthropophagy, men whose psychological trauma had been replaced by complete dependence on their captor and acceptance of practices that would have horrified them in their previous lives. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery of Endecott's correspondence with other physicians, including several letters from doctors in Kansas, Arkansas, and Illinois, expressing interest in his methods and requesting detailed information about his dietary intervention protocols. These letters suggested that Endecott's influence might have extended beyond his own facility, though no evidence was ever found that other physicians had implemented his methods. When Deputy Hayes placed Endecott under arrest, the doctor's response revealed the complete delusion that had driven his crimes. "You're making a terrible mistake," he told the officer with genuine conviction. "These men have been cured of ailments that no conventional physician could treat. What you're calling criminal, history will recognize as the foundation of a new medical science. I have documentation from European colleagues who will verify the legitimacy of my methods." Even as evidence of his crimes surrounded him, Endicott maintained that his work represented a breakthrough in treating psychological trauma. His journals contained detailed plans for expanding his operation, including correspondence with potential investors who might fund additional facilities across the Midwest. He had envisioned a network of treatment centers where what he called therapeutic consumption would revolutionize medicine's approach to mental illness. The arrest of Dr. Cornelius Endicott sent shockwaves through the medical community, not just in Missouri, but across the entire United States. Here was a Harvard-trained physician, a war veteran with impeccable credentials, who had methodically transformed a legitimate medical facility into a horror that challenged basic assumptions about human nature and medical ethics. The aftermath of the Endicott farm discoveries created a crisis that extended far beyond criminal justice into the very foundations of post-war American society. The case forced uncomfortable questions about how veterans were being treated, how medical authority was regulated, and what desperate families might unknowingly support in their search for healing. The legal proceedings that followed Endecott's arrest were conducted with unprecedented secrecy. Judge Cunningham, despite his personal involvement in the case, recused himself from presiding over the trial, which was transferred to federal jurisdiction due to what prosecutors called the sensitive nature of the evidence and the need to prevent public panic. The trial was held in a closed courtroom in St. Louis with strict orders that no details could be reported in newspapers. Dr. Cornelius Endecott's defense strategy revealed the full extent of his delusion and the sophisticated justification he had constructed for his crimes. His attorney, a prominent St. Louis lawyer named Harrison Fletcher, initially planned to argue insanity, but Endicott refused to cooperate with this approach. Instead, he insisted on presenting what he called the medical evidence for his methods. During 3 days of testimony, Endicott presented his case with the confidence of a legitimate researcher, defending controversial but scientifically sound work. He cited German medical texts, referenced European case studies, and displayed detailed records showing what he claimed were remarkable improvements in his patients' conditions. His presentation was so methodical and apparently well-researched that several observers, including medical professionals in attendance, later admitted to feeling temporarily convinced that there might be scientific merit to his claims. "Gentlemen of the jury," Endicott declared during his final statement, "you are asked to condemn practices that you don't understand based on moral prejudices that have no foundation in medical science. These men came to me broken by war, destroyed by experiences that conventional medicine could not address. I gave them peace, clarity, and purpose. If you examine their mental states before and after treatment, you will find transformation that speaks for itself." The prosecution's case was built primarily on the testimony of the surviving patients, though these testimonies presented their own disturbing challenges. Thomas Cunningham, Jonathan Prescott, and the third survivor, Marcus Webb, had to be carefully prepared for their courtroom appearances as their psychological states made normal legal testimony difficult. Thomas's testimony was particularly haunting, speaking in a calm, measured tone that his mother found more disturbing than any emotional outburst would have been. He described his treatment at Endicott Farm as the most meaningful experience of my life. He explained that Dr. Endicott had helped him understand the deeper connections between healing and sacrifice, and that his war trauma had been completely resolved through what he called participation in the essential processes of renewal. When pressed by prosecutors about the nature of his meals at the facility, Thomas showed no distress or revulsion. Dr. Endicott explained that true healing required us to accept nourishment from those who had completed their own healing journeys. He said, "It was an honor to receive such treatment, and I felt grateful to contribute to the healing of others when my time came." The psychological evaluations of the survivors revealed the devastating effectiveness of Endecott's manipulation. Dr. Augustus Peton, a psychiatrist brought in from Chicago to examine the men, reported that they had been subjected to what he called systematic psychological reconstruction that had fundamentally altered their understanding of morality, identity, and human relationships. "These men have not simply been traumatized," Dr. Peton wrote in his report. They have been methodically reprogrammed to accept and even embrace practices that would normally trigger the strongest possible revulsion. The process appears to have involved isolation, dependency, gradual introduction of taboo behaviors presented as medical treatment and reinforcement through perceived improvements in their conditions. The result is a form of psychological slavery more complete than anything I have encountered in my professional experience. Helena Endecott's testimony provided crucial insight into how a seemingly normal family had been drawn into such horror. Her mental state had deteriorated significantly since the arrests, and she spent most of her testimony in tears, describing how her husband had gradually convinced her that they were pioneering revolutionary medical treatments. "He showed me medical books and correspondence with other doctors," she sobbed. "He explained everything in scientific terms that I didn't fully understand. But that sounded legitimate. When I expressed doubts, he reminded me that Samuel seemed so much better and that we were helping men who had suffered so much during the war. I knew it felt wrong, but I believed Cornelius when he said we were saving lives." Margaret Endecott, now 19 and psychologically shattered by the realization of what her family had done, provided perhaps the most chilling testimony about life at the facility. She described helping to prepare meals that incorporated human tissue, assisting with medical procedures that she now realized were torture and murder, and participating in what her father called therapeutic discussions, where patients were gradually indoctrinated into accepting cannibalism as healing. "Father made everything seem normal and necessary," she testified. "He taught me that conventional morality was just prejudice that prevented people from accepting advanced medical treatments. I believed him because he was my father, and because he was a doctor, and because the patients seemed grateful for what we were doing. I thought we were heroes." The trial's most dramatic moment came when prosecutors presented Endecott's detailed journals, reading selected passages that documented his gradual descent from legitimate physician to systematic predator. The entries revealed not a madman, but a methodical individual who had convinced himself that his actions were not only justified, but revolutionary. One journal entry dated March 1874 was particularly damning. The conventional medical establishment's horror at anthropophagic therapies stems from ignorance and moral prejudice rather than scientific understanding. History will vindicate these methods when physicians finally accept that true healing requires participation in fundamental biological processes that civilized society has arbitrarily forbidden. The men under my care understand this truth and embrace it willingly. Dr. Endecott was convicted on 17 counts of murder and sentenced to death, though the sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment due to questions about his mental state. Helena Endecott was convicted of accessory to murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison, though she served only 12 before dying of consumption in the Missouri State Penitentiary. Margaret Endecott was placed in the care of relatives in Massachusetts and legally changed her name, disappearing from historical records after 1878. The three surviving patients presented a unique challenge for the legal system. While they were clearly victims, their complete psychological transformation made traditional rehabilitation impossible. Thomas Cunningham was eventually placed in a private asylum in Illinois, where he lived until 1923, never recovering his pre-trauma personality and continuing to request what he called proper food until his death. Jonathan Prescott was institutionalized in Chicago, where he spent his remaining years writing detailed letters to medical journals describing the revolutionary treatments he had received and encouraging doctors to study Endecott's methods. Marcus Webb returned to his family in Kentucky, but never readjusted to normal life, eventually taking his own life in 1881. The Endecott case had profound implications that extended far beyond the immediate horror of the crimes. It exposed dangerous gaps in medical regulation, revealed the vulnerability of traumatized veterans to exploitation, and raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of authority and trust in American society. In the immediate aftermath of the trial, medical licensing boards across the United States implemented new regulations requiring ongoing supervision of private medical facilities and regular inspections of treatment centers. The case also contributed to growing skepticism about experimental treatments and foreign medical theories, leading to increased emphasis on American-trained physicians and domestically developed treatment protocols. Perhaps most significantly, the ENDECOTT case influenced the development of what would eventually become modern psychiatry's understanding of trauma and its treatment. Dr. Peaton's detailed reports on the psychological manipulation techniques used at ENDECOTT Farm became foundational documents in the study of what would later be called brainwashing and psychological coercion. The case also had lasting effects on how American society viewed veterans' care. The revelation that desperate families had been willing to pay substantial fees for unproven treatments highlighted the inadequacy of conventional support for men traumatized by war. This contributed to pressure for improved veterans, hospitals, and more systematic approaches to treating what the medical community was beginning to recognize as legitimate war-related psychological injuries. But perhaps the most disturbing legacy of the ENDECOTT case was the discovery that the doctor's influence had extended beyond his own facility. During the investigation, authorities found correspondence between ENDECOTT and at least 12 other physicians in 6 different states, all expressing interest in his dietary intervention protocols. While no evidence was ever found that other doctors had implemented ENDECOTT's methods, the letters revealed a disturbing willingness within the medical community to consider experimental treatments that challenged basic ethical boundaries. One letter from a doctor, William Hartwell in Kansas, was particularly troubling. "Your reports on anthropophagic therapy are fascinating and suggest possibilities that conventional medicine has been too prejudiced to explore. I have several patients here who might benefit from such innovative approaches. Could you provide more detailed protocols for implementation?" These letters were quietly investigated by federal authorities, leading to the discovery of at least 3 other medical facilities where patients had disappeared under suspicious circumstances. While no definitive connections to cannibalistic practices were established, the investigations revealed a pattern of experimental treatments that pushed ethical boundaries and exploited vulnerable patients. The farmhouse itself was burned to the ground in 1877, 2 years after ENDECOTT's conviction, in what officials called a public health measure. Local residents had refused to approach the property, and several families had moved away from the area entirely, claiming that the land itself had been contaminated by what had occurred there. The small cemetery behind the house containing the remains of ENDECOTT's victims was relocated to Carthage's municipal cemetery, though the graves were left unmarked at the request of surviving family members. Martha Cunningham spent the rest of her life advocating for improved oversight of medical facilities and support for veterans' families. She established a fund that provided assistance to families seeking treatment for war-traumatized relatives, and she worked with state legislators to strengthen laws governing private medical practice. Her diary, published posthumously in 1923, became an important historical document about both the ENDECOTT case and the broader challenges faced by Civil War veterans' families. The case continued to influence American medicine and law enforcement for decades. Police departments developed new protocols for investigating suspicious medical facilities, and medical schools began, including ethics courses that used the ENDECOTT case as an example of how professional authority could be corrupted by personal obsession and pseudo-scientific theories. In 1925, 50 years after the discovery of ENDECOTT Farm, a team of researchers from the University of Missouri attempted to locate and exhume the graves to conduct more thorough forensic analysis. However, they found that the burial sites had been deliberately obscured, and despite extensive searching, they were unable to locate the remains. Local residents, many of whom were descendants of people who had lived through the original case, refused to cooperate with the investigation, suggesting that the community preferred to let the dead rest undisturbed. The story of Dr. Cornelius Endicott and his farm of horrors serves as a chilling reminder of how authority, desperation, and pseudoscience can combine to create unimaginable evil. What makes the case particularly disturbing is not just the nature of the crimes, but the systematic way in which Endicott convinced himself, his family, and even his victims that cannibalism could be transformed into medicine through the application of scientific methodology and medical authority. The case files, sealed for more than 70 years, were finally opened to researchers in 1947, revealing details that had been considered too disturbing for public consumption during the immediate post-Civil War period. These documents showed that Endecott's operation was far more extensive and sophisticated than even the original investigators had realized, and that his influence on both his victims and his family had been more complete and lasting than anyone had imagined. Perhaps most troubling was the discovery that Endicott had been in regular correspondence with European physicians who claimed to be conducting similar research. While authorities were never able to verify whether these correspondences were with legitimate researchers or represented an international network of medical criminals, the letters suggested that Endecott's practices might not have been as unique as originally believed. The psychological techniques that Endicott used to manipulate his patients became subjects of study by early psychiatrists and criminologists, contributing to our modern understanding of how systematic abuse can reshape human psychology. His methods of gradual indoctrination, dependency creation, and authority exploitation would later be recognized as precursors to techniques used by totalitarian regimes and cult leaders. The three men who survived Endecott's treatment never fully recovered, spending their remaining years as living testimonies to the completeness of his psychological manipulation. Their cases became foundational studies in what would eventually be recognized as Stockholm Syndrome and other forms of trauma bonding. Though the medical community of the 1872nd lacked the conceptual framework to fully understand what had been done to them, the Endicott case also influenced the development of medical ethics as a formal discipline. The revelation that a Harvard-trained physician could systematically abuse his authority to commit such crimes led to new requirements for medical education, ongoing supervision of practitioners, and formal ethical guidelines that are still fundamental to medical practice today. In many ways, the case anticipated concerns about medical experimentation that would become central to 20th century discussions of research ethics. Endecott's conviction that he was conducting legitimate scientific research despite the absence of proper controls, peer review, or ethical oversight highlighted dangers that would resurface in later medical scandals involving unauthorized human experimentation. The fate of the surviving family members remained a source of speculation for decades. Margaret Endecott's new identity was never discovered by researchers, though census records suggest she may have married and lived a quiet life in New England under her assumed name. Helena Endicott died in prison, but not before writing a detailed confession that provided additional insights into how her husband had gradually drawn her into complicity with his crimes. The burned remains of Endicott Farm were eventually purchased by the state of Missouri and incorporated into a state forest, ensuring that the land would never again be used for private development. Park rangers reported that even decades later, visitors to the area often complained of feeling uneasy or disturbed without knowing the location's history. Though whether this represented genuine psychological residue or simply the power of suggestion remains unclear. The medical instruments found in Endecott's basement laboratory were destroyed by court order, but detailed photographs and descriptions were preserved in law enforcement archives. These documents became important historical evidence for understanding both 19th century medical practices and the methods used by medical criminals to disguise torture as treatment. Dr. Cornelius Endicott died in the Missouri State Penitentiary in 1889, 14 years after his conviction. Prison records indicate that he never expressed remorse for his crimes and continued until his death to insist that his methods represented legitimate medical innovation that had been suppressed by ignorance and prejudice. His final words, according to the prison chaplain, were a request that his journals be preserved for future medical researchers who would eventually vindicate his work. The Endicott case remains one of the most disturbing examples of medical criminality in American history, not just because of the nature of the crimes, but because of how completely it demonstrated the potential for authority, desperation, and self-deception to create systematic horror. The fact that Endicott maintained his conviction in the legitimacy of his methods until his death suggests that the greatest dangers sometimes come not from those who know they are doing evil, but from those who have convinced themselves that their evil serves a higher purpose. Today, more than 150 years after the discovery of Endicott Farm, the case continues to serve as a cautionary tale about the importance of ethical oversight, the vulnerability of desperate people to exploitation, and the terrible consequences that can result when scientific authority is combined with moral blindness. The 17 men who died at Endicott Farm and the 3 who survived but were forever changed stand as reminders of how quickly the promise of healing can become the reality of horror when society fails to maintain adequate safeguards against those who would abuse positions of trust. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed about Dr. Endecott's operation, or might there be darker secrets still buried in the Missouri hills? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts about this disturbing chapter in American medical history. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. The past holds many secrets, and some of them are more terrifying than anything fiction could imagine. See you in the next video where we'll uncover another dark truth that history tried to forget.